Today, flight still has the power to mesmerize and fascinate. Millions of us may fly every year, in much the same way as one takes a train. Yet moving around in the sky still provides that sense of excitement and anticipation and fear that even Icarus of Greek legend would have known. And despite flight being commonplace, we still marvel at those who are prepared to test its limits, to go that little bit faster, higher, or further. The mastery of flight remains one of mankind's great achievements, and there are few better places to witness this mastery than at an air show. On the one hand, you can see an aircraft like this Blériot, which flew before the First World War, when flight was still in its infancy. Europe was electrified when Frenchman Louis Blériot became the first man to fly across the English Channel in July 1909. It is controlled by a system of cables which distort the shape of the wing. Needless to say, it is perilously fragile and can only be flown when conditions are just right. At the same show, one may well see the very latest aircraft, like this Airbus A340-600. Not only is it the longest passenger aircraft ever to fly, but also it can fly all the way from London to Australia without stopping. It too uses a system of cables to control its progress through the air. But these are cables that carry data to and from a computer, which then sets the aircraft's controls for optimum flight performance. For the many thousands of people watching the spectacle, it's a dramatic reminder of how far the aeroplane has come in only 100 years. There is only one photograph of man's first powered flight. It was taken just after 10:35 on Thursday, the 17th of December in 1903. The location is the Kill Devil Sand Dunes at Kitty Hawk in North Carolina. Orville Wright is at the controls, while his brother Wilbur, who has been running alongside to steady the right wing, has been left behind as the machine gathers speed. The flight will last just 12 seconds, and Orville Wright will have flown some 36 meters, roughly half the length of the Airbus. But it sets in motion the sequence of events and developments that lead us directly to the Airbus. The Flyer, as it was called, was the result of centuries of experimentation by many who preceded Wilbur and Orville Wright. But it was the brothers' near obsession with control that marked out their project as the one that was most likely to succeed. They came to understand through a process of experimentation the best way of controlling an aeroplane in 3 dimensions. For example, they came to realize that the best way of getting an aeroplane to turn was to roll it round its longitudinal axis, making the process of turning much easier and faster. But the brothers were so secretive about their achievement that word was slow to spread. And when people did get to hear about it, many remained skeptical. Nowhere was this so apparent than in France, which was the center for aviation in Europe. Here, a motley group of showmen, scientists, engineers, and men with money to burn each competed for that ultimate accolade, the first man to fly. Long after the Wright brothers had perfected their machines, Europe's foremost aviators were still struggling to defy gravity. But slowly and painfully, they reinvented the aeroplane and followed the Wright brothers into the sky. The most significant of these early European efforts at flight was by Brazilian Alberto Santos Dumont, who had adopted France as his home. In November 1906, his unwieldy machine, christened 14 bis, flew 722 feet in 21.5 seconds. It was the first powered flight in Europe, and the achievement electrified the continent. Europe's aviators gamely continued with their experiments as the Wright brothers' achievements gradually became but a distant memory. In France, the Voisin brothers tried any number of ideas, usually at the behest of their customers. Then, in January 1908, Henry Farman flew the first officially recorded 1-kilometer circuit in 1 minute, 28 seconds, and so won a prize of 50,000 French francs. But it was not until Wilbur Wright finally came to France in 1908 that aviation in Europe received a much-needed boost in solving some fundamental problems. The Wrights had developed a system of wing warping as a means of providing lateral control, something that had so far eluded European aviators. During September of 1908, Wilbur Wright performed a number of demonstrations at Le Mans, to the southwest of Paris. Thousands flocked to witness his flights, culminating on September the 21st, when he flew for over 1.5 hours. Of course, the Wright brothers were hoping to secure orders and licenses for their machines, but Wilbur's flights underlined how far they had gone and how far Europe still had to go. In Britain, American-born showman Samuel F. Cody attempted to raise military interest in his flying machine. By 1908 standards, its 52-foot wingspan was enormous, earning the contraption the nickname Cathedral. But it was in July 1909 that military complacency towards aviation began to change. 2 men attempted to fly across the Channel. Both had every chance of success, but a quirky twist of fate meant that only one would earn his place in history: Louis Blériot. By European standards, crossing the English Channel was regarded as a significant milestone in flight. In recognition of the challenge, the Daily Mail offered a prize of £1,000 for the first person to fly across the Channel in daylight. 2 men stepped forward: Hubert Latham and Louis Blériot. Latham was the first to attempt the crossing in an Antoinette monoplane powered by a 25-horsepower engine. Thousands flocked both sides of the Channel to watch the attempt. But Latham was barely 7 miles out when the engine failed at 1,000 feet. He was forced to ditch in the sea and await transportation back to Calais in a Navy escort. Undaunted, he declared his intent to try again in a new aeroplane. Watching from the sidelines on crutches, having burnt a leg in a crash, was Louis Blériot. Blériot had spent all his money and his wife's dowry in the pursuit of aviation. But a last-minute windfall made it possible for him to mount his own challenge in an aircraft of his own design, the Blériot 11. On Sunday, July the 25th, Blériot judged the conditions to be just right. As dawn lit the sky, he took off from the shore near Calais while Latham slept. 37 minutes later, Blériot landed in a grassy hollow by Dover Castle. It was only then that people began to realize how close he had been to failure. He had been within sight of the white cliffs of Dover when gusts began pushing his frail aircraft northwards. For 10 minutes, he was totally lost until he spotted 3 ships heading towards what he assumed to be the port of Dover. Then he spotted the French flag being waved at the spot he had chosen to land. Swirling gusts made his landing a hard one, and although the aircraft was damaged, Blériot was unhurt and ready to take his place in history. Today, there are few examples of aircraft representing this pioneering era still flying. Even faithful replicas are very fragile and tricky to fly. The Shuttleworth collection at Old Warden Airfield, just to the north of London, has several fine examples of aircraft from the pre-First World War era. One example, the Blériot 11, is the oldest flying aircraft in the world. Given its provenance, it rarely flies, and then only as a series of hops along the airfield runway. Blériot's flight may have lasted only 37 minutes, but it was seen as an epic achievement and one that captured the imagination of an adoring public. To the Wright brothers, crossing a channel meant nothing. They had flown many times that distance already. But arguably, they were damaging their cause by underestimating its significance in European eyes and the enthusiasm generated by the attendant publicity. The sense of euphoria continued when 4 weeks later, the cream of Europe's pioneers met for the world's first flying competition at Reims. The only representative from the United States was Glenn Curtiss, who, although unknown in Europe, had carved out a formidable reputation as an engine builder in his home country. High society flocked to the airfield outside Reims to watch flyers compete for prizes in altitude, distance, even passenger carrying. But the most prestigious event was to be the competition for the International Aviation Cup, or the Gordon Bennett Trophy, as it became more popularly known. Glenn Curtiss won the competition by a mere 6 seconds over Louis Blériot. By proving their machines in competition, the aviators had shown how far flying had traveled in the 6 years since Kitty Hawk. In the years that followed, more and more events would force the pace of development. First, the challenges of distance and altitude were overcome as more and more of Europe's natural obstacles and boundaries were crossed by aviators. At the same time, the performance envelope of aircraft was pushed ever outwards. In September 1913, Frenchman Adolphe Foucault astounded the aviation world by flying upside down for 500 yards and then righting his machine. This was followed by his demonstration of the first inside loop, something that was, until then, considered more than the human body could stand. Beyond his obvious showmanship was a desire to explore the limits of what man and machine could do. Earlier that year, he had worked with Louis Blériot on a hook and cable system for landing planes on a ship at sea. He then became the first pilot to parachute from an aircraft. Having successfully landed, he watched as his plane continued to fly before plunging into the ground. By now, it was 1913, and Europe was plunging recklessly towards war, a war in which aviation would come of age. Many countries were now making up for lost time, none more so than Great Britain. Among the foremost designers was Alliard Verden-Rohe, who had begun studying flight by watching seabirds on the wing. One of his earliest creations was a triplane, which was one of the first to use small, movable surfaces called ailerons. These provided better control than the wing warping of its contemporaries and would become standard on aircraft for the next 90 years. In 1913, he designed one of the most successful aircraft of all time, the Avro 504. Thousands were built, and later models were still flying well into the 1930s. A great many people experienced flight for the first time in an Avro 504. In 1913, 504s equipped Britain's 2 fledgling armed air services, the Royal Flying Corps, the RFC, and the Royal Naval Air Service, or RNAS. The original intention had been to have a single air service, but the Admiralty was determined to retain control over all matters it regarded as naval. Aware that aerial reconnaissance could improve the effectiveness of its ships, it began referring to the naval wing as the Royal Naval Air Service, and operating as a completely separate entity to the Royal Flying Corps. By now, war in Europe was inevitable. Britain was determined to make up for lost time, and a concerted effort was made to train new airmen. Compared with today, the training was extremely basic, as the aircraft's controls were rudimentary, and there was little in the way of theory to pass on. It was more a case of if the trainee pilot landed the aeroplane in one piece, then he was qualified. By the eve of the First World War in the summer of 1914, the Royal Flying Corps had 63 aircraft, 146 officers, and 1,097 other ranks with which to support the army. The Royal Naval Air Service had 50 aeroplanes, 130 officers, and 700 other ranks. Its responsibility was the defense of Britain and its coastal waters. Tensions in Europe reached breaking point on June the 28th, 1914. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, was assassinated in Sarajevo. It was the catalyst that sent Europe rushing headlong into war. Across Europe, threats were met with counter-threats as the alliances that had provided some sort of deterrence collided head-on. Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire on one side, Britain, France and Russia on the other. The final straw came on the 4th of August. Germany invaded Belgium, whose neutrality was supposed to have been guaranteed in a treaty signed by Britain, France and Germany. Germany's Kaiser dismissed the treaty as a mere scrap of paper, plunging Europe into one of the bloodiest wars in history. A war that would cost its participants dearly and blight the world long after peace had been declared 4 years later. Germany's military plan was to use highly mobile forces to mount a lightning attack on France through Belgium, where defenses were weakest. With France defeated, the German army could then board trains and quickly move to the east to attack Russia. The German plan nearly worked. By the beginning of September, the German army was in the Marne region to the north of Paris. It looked as if the capital might fall. The French, determined to save Paris, threw everything they had in defense. Able-bodied men of all ages drove to the front in taxis, only to be slaughtered in thousands. But their will to resist and the timely arrival of British reinforcements meant that the line held. For the moment, the German advance was halted in its tracks. Then an RFC crew of BE-2 biplane observed sections of the German army changing the direction of their advance in order to strike at the flank of the French. British forces were rushed to block the move. It was a decisive moment in the evolution of air power. Before the war, military planners had had no clear vision of how the aeroplane might be useful for war. Now it was clear that aircraft were going to be very useful in reconnaissance roles. Reconnaissance flights were also extremely useful to the artillery, who began relying on pilots' reports to adjust the fall of their shells. In fact, aircraft proved so useful in the reconnaissance role that new aircraft, like the Vickers gun bus, were specially designed for the purpose. They were known as pushers because the engine was mounted behind the pilot. This gave the observers seated in the front a clear field of view of the battlefield below. The rapid progress in wireless telegraphy meant that information could be passed back to the artillery batteries without the need to land. But the war on the ground was going nowhere, and at sea the mighty fleets of both sides remained safely in their ports, as they were too valuable to risk in open waters. To the troops on the ground, enveloped in mud and cold, the war in the air must have seemed like some wonderful adventure compared to the grind and misery of trench warfare. The truth was rather different. Aircraft were proving so useful at observation that airmen started shooting at each other. Soon, new aircraft equipped with machine guns appeared, with the sole purpose of shooting down other aircraft. Air power had now a new and more deadly purpose: control of the sky. The Germans made the first major breakthrough with the Fokker Eindecker, which appeared over the Western Front in July 1915. Its machine guns were synchronized with the engine so that they could fire through the propeller. The pilot simply had to point his aircraft at his opponent in order to fire accurately. The Fokker's other unique feature was its flying tail, in which the entire surface of the tail moves. Although all modern fighters have flying tails, it took nearly 30 years before such a feature appeared again, this time on the German-built Messerschmitt Me-262. British pilots were helpless in the face of what they called the Fokker scourge. But design and manufacture of new aircraft was better organized, so that new, more advanced aircraft began to arrive in the front lines. One of the first aircraft to emerge was the SE-5A in April 1917. It was one of the first British aircraft built specifically as a fighter, a role it performed with great success. It was extremely rugged and powerful, nearly twice as fast as the aircraft which had equipped the RFC in 1914. It also made a steady gun platform, armed with a synchronized Vickers machine gun, as well as a Lewis gun mounted on the top wing. The SE-5A proved to be more than a match for most German aircraft, and gradually the Allies gained superiority in the skies over the Western Front. The SE-5A was joined in the front line by the Sopwith triplane. Its short wings enabled it to turn much more quickly, as well as providing it with an extraordinary rate of climb. Nearly all of the 150 or so triplanes built went to the RNAS squadrons in France, where they achieved great success. One unit, B Flight of number 10 Squadron, accounted for at least 87 enemy aircraft between May and July 1917. Not surprisingly, German pilots were so alarmed by this aircraft that they demanded one of their own. The result was the legendary Fokker triplane, which proved deadly against slower reconnaissance machines. By July 1917, a new fighter was arriving in numbers, which was arguably the best fighter produced by any country during the war, the Sopwith Camel. It was called the Camel because of the hump created by the housing for the machine guns. Although in inexperienced hands it was difficult to fly, the Camel was a very capable fighting machine on account of its excellent maneuverability. Pilots flying Camels claimed more than 3,000 combat kills, more than any other Allied fighter. Although manuals on aerial combat began to appear, pilots learned by bitter experience that the most important tactic in air combat was to get as high as possible, preferably with the sun behind you, and get on your opponent's tail. Twisting and turning, the pilots performed their deadly ballet day after day. To the public at home, the pilots were knights of the air, heroes locked in noble combat, man against man. The reality was far removed from such gentlemanly aspirations. Air combat became known as dogfighting, because that is what it was like, vicious and chaotic. The skies would be filled with whirling machines one minute, and the next clear blue skies. There were no parachutes, so if the losing pilot wasn't killed outright, he faced a long plummet earthwards, probably in a machine that was burning around him. Life expectancy for frontline pilots averaged a few weeks. But this is not what the public and politicians wanted to hear. The accomplishments of the aviators were the one bright spot in an otherwise bleak war. Legends were created on both sides. Pilots with more than 5 kills were called aces. They became household names: Ball, McCutton, Bishop, and the most successful British ace, Mick Mannock. But the most famous and respected ace of them all was the Red Baron, Manfred von Richthofen. But neither he nor Mannock survived the war. Both were shot down by ground fire in 1918. But there was another side to the air war that was far from glamorous or, in the eyes of the public, heroic. Large bombers meant that cities hundreds of miles behind the front lines could be attacked. Britain had already had a foretaste of this kind of warfare when Zeppelin airships had attacked London and other British cities in December 1914, sometimes at night. The sense of public shock and outrage was all too predictable, for Britain had no aircraft available for home defence. It was the need for coordinated defence against attack that led to the formation of Britain's Royal Air Force on April 1st, 1918, the world's first independent armed air service. By then, it had become the largest and best equipped air force in the world. There were over 27,000 officers and more than 260,000 personnel. The RAF had 3,300 aircraft, equipping almost 150 operational squadrons. Several types, like the Bristol fighter, were among the best aircraft designed during this era. What's more, the majority of the aircraft had been produced by British manufacturers, mostly through private enterprise. The pace of innovation had been extraordinary. Aircraft could now fly twice as high and fast as they could at the outbreak of war. Engines had also become much more reliable and efficient. It was also possible to build some very large aircraft, like the Vickers Vimy, and carry the war to the enemy's cities. The Vimy carried a crew of 4 and just over 1,100 kilos of bombs. The 2 Rolls-Royce Eagle engines gave it an endurance of 11 hours. Bombers like these would provide the backbone of the RAF's heavy bomber force until the early 1930s. And, following the end of the war in 1918, they would help pioneer new civilian roles, transporting passengers and freight around the world. In the 15 years that separated Kitty Hawk and the end of the First World War, the aeroplane had become an essential weapon of war. The critical roles of air combat, bombing, reconnaissance and transport had all been tried and refined to the point that military commanders would, from now on, have to make control of the skies a central objective in wars of the future. Following the end of hostilities in 1918, there was a dramatic scaling back of armed forces, the peace dividend, as we call it today. The world had had enough of war. The cost in human terms had been too high. Also, this first war of the industrial age had crippled the economies of many countries. Aircraft were expensive to make, and so development of military aircraft slowed virtually to a halt. Attention now turned to see how aviation could help forge closer bonds around the world. In 1909, the English Channel had been regarded as the first great natural obstacle to be overcome. Now, in 1919, it was the Atlantic Ocean that captured the public imagination. The first transatlantic flight was made on June 14, 1919, when 2 Royal Air Force crew, John Alcock and Arthur Brown, took 16 hours and 28 minutes to fly from Greenland to Ireland in a Vickers Vimy. The aeroplane had joined 2 continents, but arguably an even greater challenge lay in flying the furthest of them all, Australia. In 1919, it seemed an impossible challenge. Certainly, no aircraft could fly across the Pacific from the west coast of the United States. The alternative was to fly eastwards across Europe, Middle East, and down through Southeast Asia. It would mean flying over some of the most inhospitable deserts and jungles on Earth. But there were no shortage of takers, especially when the Australian government put up a prize of £10,000. It was a grim morning on November the 12th, 1919, when a team led by two brothers, Ross and Keith Smith, took off from Hounslow in their Vimy. The plane's registration, GEAOU, was interpreted by the crew as meaning, "God help all of us," and they would need it. For the flight to succeed, they would need to take enough spares to cover any emergencies, but not too many, as the extra weight would shorten their chances. Inevitably, the flight did not go without incident, including smashing the tail skid on a tree stump, which had been left on a hastily prepared landing ground in Malaya. As it was one item for which there was no spare, one of the engineers, Jim Bennett, had to make a new one. Finally, after 28 days and perilously short of fuel, they arrived in Darwin to a rapturous reception. Nine years later, the same route was followed by Bert Hinkler in an Avro Avian. His solo effort was completed in 15 days, which was as much a testament to Hinkler's stamina as the speed of his fragile biplane. Throughout the years between the wars, the frontiers of flight were pushed back as man sought to fly ever higher, faster, and further. Aircraft were especially built in order to establish new records. One of the most famous of these was the Spirit of St. Louis, in which Charles Lindbergh completed his epic solo flight across the Atlantic in May 1927.